This episode of the Visu.News podcast, I speak with author Dr. Reece Jones, who has a new book out this week titled Nobody is Protected: How the Border Patrol Became the Most Dangerous Police Force in the United States. The book is the untold story of how, through a series of landmark but largely unknown decisions, the Supreme Court has dramatically curtailed the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution in service of policing borders. The Border Patrol exercises exceptional powers to conduct warrantless stops and interrogations within 100 miles of land borders or coastlines, an area that includes 9 of the 10 largest cities and 2/3 of the American population. Dr. Reece Jones is also the author of White Borders: The History of Race and Immigration in the United States from Chinese Exclusion to the Border Wall. He is a Guggenheim Fellow and a professor and the chair of the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Hawai'i.
Give me an intro. Tell me a little bit about yourself and why. You're from Virginia. Like, what got you into focusing on border policy?
Yeah, it's a long story for how I started focusing on border policy, but I became interested specifically in the Border Patrol because I was writing a book about border walls about a decade ago. And I was in Texas, kind of south of El Paso, with a rancher, and we were driving to his lands, and we were on a public Texas road. And in the 1 hour that we spent driving down to his lands, looking at the wetlands beyond the border wall, and then back to where we parked my car near the interstate, we were stopped by the Border Patrol 5 times, pulled over, interrogated about what we were doing driving on this road. And it was shocking to me. I mean, I knew in theory that the Border Patrol had a lot of authority, but I just couldn't believe that they could really stop the same car 5 times in 1 hour with no evidence that we were doing anything. And so I decided at that moment, I have to look into this and I have to understand what the legal basis of it is. And as I learned more and more about it, I learned that it's not just at the border that they can do this, right? That they can do that within 100 miles of borders and coastlines, which is this vast area where 2/3 of the US population roughly lives, and a lot of the major cities are in that 100-mile zone. And so I decided to write a book about it.
Yeah, I mean, even though we were having this kind of national, because I mean that was something that when I went down in 2014 to cover the one of the border crises in quotes, every couple of years we actually pay attention to what's happening on the border, and driving from, I think it was probably from Dallas to McAllen, and going through the fact that there's just a random checkpoint. And I think about because I cover extremism as well, and I think about the conspiracy, we're gonna have Alex Jones complains about checkpoints and DWI stops and thing, and yet they all live in a zone where this is just normal practice, and no one on a national level, even as we're having kind of this conversation about policing in America, Border Patrol really hasn't, I don't think, other than this little thing about Portland, we were really having that conversation. Now, why do you think that is?
Yeah, borders generally and immigration in the US has become something that's part of kind of the security discourse. And once it fell into that after September 11th and with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, there's a tendency, I think, on both sides of the political aisle to kind of just not tread into that territory, right? That if the border agencies say they need these things for security, it's at least from even people on the left tend to defer to that and just say, well, that's necessary to secure our country. But of course, the problem with that is it's been unchecked for so long that they are extending that into just such a wide range of things that's far beyond what they were originally designated to do. Of course, they were originally designated. The Border Patrol was created in 1924, and they were 2 days after the national origins quotas were put into law, which was a eugenics-based law that was designed to prevent non-white people from entering the United States. So the Border Patrol was created to essentially enforce the racial hierarchy of the country. But when they were founded, they were meant to be just at the border. In the book, I talk about how in the 1920s and 1930s, a series of lawmakers and officials in the Treasury Department tried to rein the Border Patrol back in and to get them to go back to the borderline and to not operate in the interior of the United States. But they eventually lost that effort. And in the decades and decades since then, they've continued to do racial policing like they were founded to do, but to do that deeper and deeper into the US.
Yeah, I mean, just what was it, this month, I think, or last month it would have been, that we had the Supreme Court basically clearing the Border Patrol to basically as a completely nearly unaccountable police force. I mean, police are, it's tough to actually have any sort of accountability in general, but it seems that ruling just seems to have completely cleared them to kind of act however they want, because they are not just because they are police, but because they are a special class of police in America.
Yeah, that's right. That's Egbert versus Boulay. So this was a case where an American citizen, Robert Boulay, was on his property in Washington State. And Eric Egbert, a Border Patrol agent, came into his driveway and accused Robert Boulay of harboring someone who was undocumented and was trying to cross the border. In this case, the Border Patrol agent wasn't wrong about that. Robert Boulay does run a place. The place is called the Smuggler's Inn.
Yeah, it's a little on the nose.
Yeah. and he has been convicted of smuggling before. But in this instance, the Border Patrol agent had no evidence of this. And what happened is he came on to Robert Boulay's property, and then he shoved him against a car and eventually threw him on the ground. So it's a clear example of assault by a federal agent. But the Supreme Court decided, building on some previous rulings, which I'll talk about in just a second, that because the assault happened in the course of the agent's official duties, there was no recourse for him to be sued for damages for that. And this ruling applies not just to the Border Patrol, but to all federal agents. It undid a 1971 ruling called Bivens versus 6 unnamed federal agents that had created a small space to sue federal agents if they violate your constitutional rights. But the Supreme Court has rolled that back. They had previously rolled that back in another case in 2020, Hernandez v. Mesa, which is it's hard to believe, an even more outrageous case. But in this instance, the Border Patrol agent had shot and killed a 15-year-old Mexican boy standing in Mexico. And so the family of the boy had tried to sue the agent in court. It's all on video. There's no disputing what happened. It happened directly under one of the main border crossings in El Paso. But nevertheless, the Supreme Court decided in that case that because the killing actually happened in Mexico, that they had no standing in the US courts. And so that was kind of the first narrowing of Bivens. And this case this year really kind of ended that opportunity to sue federal agents for constitutional violations. So that means that, the Border Patrol has essentially free reign, you could say, in this 100-mile zone. And in the book, of course, I talk about the other previous rulings that had already given them a number of carve-outs to the Fourth Amendment. Yeah, I mean,
I known of, because my own work, oh my God, I'm looking for, I keep forgetting the name of the case, Brignoni and Ponce, if I'm saying that correctly. And that ruling, you delve into it really well and explained it a lot better than the like kind of the random reading that I've come across over the last couple of years about it. Could you tell me a bit about that case and about how that seemingly kind of like established and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of it seemed to have established the ongoing precedent of what the Border Patrol, kind of the level of force that the level of power that they would have go in the 50 years since.
Yeah. Yeah, so the kind of the meat of the book of Nobody is Protected is looking at three key cases in the mid 1970s, in 1973, 75, and 76, that really laid out the parameters for what the Border Patrol can and can't do in the 100-mile zone. These cases came to the court because prior to that, the congressional authorization for the Border Patrol had said that they could stop and search any vehicle in that 100-mile zone. And that's what they'd been doing for their first 50 years of existence. But finally, the Supreme Court considered whether that was a violation of the Fourth Amendment in the 1970s. In the first of those cases, which was specifically about searches of vehicles, which is Alameda Sanchez in 1973, they did rule that the Border Patrol cannot search any vehicle in the border zone. So they have the same rules as regular police for searches. And in the book, I document how it was a very last minute change of heart by one of the justices that switched the ruling in that case. So they were poised to say that the Border Patrol could search any vehicle in the 100-mile zone. The case you mentioned, which is Brignone Ponce, which is in 1975, this was a case where a man, Felix Brignone Ponce, who was Puerto Rican, so he's an American citizen, was driving from San Diego to Los Angeles at night in March of 1973. And he had two other people in his car with him. And there were two Border Patrol agents parked on the side of the road, 60 miles north of the border on a main interstate highway, right? This is I-5 between San Diego and Los Angeles. And they had turned their vehicle to have their headlights shine into the road to see what cars were passing. And so when Felix passed, they thought that he looked Mexican. And so based on only that evidence, they pulled him over and interrogated him. And they determined that indeed the two people in his car were undocumented and he was smuggling these people to Los Angeles. And so he was convicted of that. But his lawyers felt like that was just a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment, that the evidence they found by interrogating him should have been suppressed because his race alone is not a justification to pull over the vehicle. So the Supreme Court considered this in 1975, and they ended up ruling unanimously in Felix Brignone Ponce's favor. And so they said that race alone as the only factor is not sufficient for the Border Patrol to pull over a vehicle. And so it's this paradoxical case, right? So the Border Patrol actually lost the case, right? But nevertheless, in that ruling, that behind the scenes, as I document in the book, there was all this pressure on the justices to establish what the rules were for when they could pull over a vehicle. And so in the ruling, they lay out 14 different factors that a Border Patrol agent could use to make a stop. And these factors are broad. They include
to say the
things,
least,
driving on a border road, driving in a station wagon, things like that. But the list also includes race. So it mentions specifically things like Mexican style haircuts, Mexican mode of dress, the familiarity of Border Patrol agents with what type of people do smuggling, right? And so all of those are racial things. And so what the ruling says is that the agents can't use race as the only factor, but it can combine race with at least one other factor. And so because the list is so broad, it's created this situation where the Border Patrol can stop any vehicle in that 100-mile zone and come up with at least two facts for why they made the stop. And so I told the story of me getting stopped 5 times in an hour, and that's definitely fits into this same sort of characteristic. So it was driving on a bordered road and the type of people we see smuggling, right? And so they could justify that stop, and the Supreme Court has said that's legal.
So do you, I'm looking at a photo of you and I don't know, I wouldn't say that you have a Mexican style haircut, which to me is just the wild, this idea of like this, I think we learned a little bit about this, back when SB 1070 was a conversation when it was being kind of, a lot of this stuff was being kind of turned over to the entirety of the state and federal, or not federal, but state level, or even a city cop or something like that could kind of go along with this. But it is just, I think that's one of the things that really blows me away about this book, but also just about the power of the Border Patrol, is that we've had that a lot of this isn't actually it seems like it isn't, the Border Patrol seems to be completely controlled by or defined by by the Supreme Court, which is something that we've been seeing kind of a lot lately, where it's just like we have immigration policy is not actually being made in policy, it's being made by Supreme Court decisions. I don't know if that's not really a question, more than just like something I've noticed, but it's interesting. I'm sorry, but
yeah, in the
go ahead. Sorry, yeah.
In the hearings, I tell this story in the book too, but there are these two amazing lawyers for the federal defenders of San Diego, who are the ones that argue all of these cases in the 1970s. And the lead lawyer, this guy named John Cleary, who passed away a couple of years ago, but he is just indignant about this Mexican haircut claim, right? And he's based in San Diego, and in the oral arguments, he says to the justices, I myself have gotten my haircut in Tijuana, right? Like, this is ridiculous, right? But nevertheless, it ends up in the opinion. So, so despite his indignation and his really good oral arguments, nevertheless, it's the law of the land.
Yeah, I mean, especially considering, but I think that, like, again, like over the last couple of years, we've had a good kind of exposing of the police unions and that sort of thing. But I mean, I got an opportunity to interview I forget his name, the head of the Border Patrol union a couple of years ago, and it is mind blowing. Like, because I mean, like, you have the kind of like the police unions, and like, I lived in New York City and covered police violence quite a bit, and was committed a lot of police violence against me. But is the fact that those guys are pretty out there, but the Border Patrol, I mean, they came hard for Trump. They are not kind of, mind you, it's a multiracial thing, so it's like it's more complicated, but it's kind of shocking how open they are about what they want to do with their force. And I mean, you say in here, right, that like basically it's coming closer and closer to a national police force. And do you think that that's like where they want to go? I mean, like, what do you think that the Border Patrol itself sees themselves as doing?
Yeah, so the Border Patrol, the union chief, his name is Brandon Judd, and he's been in that position for a while. And just in case listeners are wondering how representative they are, something like 15,000 of the 20,000 or 19,000 Border Patrol agents are members of the union. So, so it is a largely representative union, but it is an extremist union as well. They were one of the first groups to endorse Donald Trump in his run for the presidency, and were advocates of him from the start. And during his presidency as well, continuously releasing statements supporting his really aggressive actions at the border. And they've continued that role in the Biden administration. They regularly appear on Fox News, and they talk about the nonsensical claims, right, that the border is open, and that there's an open border policy, and that's causing the problems. But nevertheless, it's an extremist group for sure, and has been for many years. In terms of the National Police Force, I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that we have 20,000 Border Patrol agents, roughly. And that's a huge increase over the number that existed in the past. But in the past, in the 1970s and 1990s, there were more people crossing the border on average than there have been in the last few years, right? So, so that what that means is there are all of these agents with relatively little to do. So I tallied it up for the entire decade from 2010 to 2019. The average Border Patrol agent made 2 apprehensions per month during that period of time, in that entire decade. Right. So that's 1 apprehension like every 10 days on duty or something like that. If we look at just the last year or two, where there's been an increase in apprehensions at the border after Title 42, that number only increases to 7 apprehensions per month per Border Patrol agent. And so that's why we see this creep into all of these other purposes for the Border Patrol. And one of those is internal policing. So during the Trump administration in the summer of 2020, when there were Black Lives Matters protests across the US, the Border Patrol was at the front of the line to be redeployed into interior cities to serve these other purposes. There's a law from kind of the War on Terror era in the Department of Homeland Security's authorization that allows the DHS secretary to redeploy federal officers to federal buildings. But in that law, it says that they can do investigations and make arrests without a warrant for, quote, any felony cognizable under the laws of the United States, and that they can, quote, conduct investigations on and off the property in question. So a broad reading of that law would say that that's essentially a national police force, right? Any felony, any location, right? And so if you remember in Portland, there were those incidents of, and I tell these stories in the book as well, of people walking on streets in Portland late at night, and a van pulling up and camouflaged agents without any indication of who they were, grabbing those people off the street, throwing them in the vans and speeding off. That was the Border Patrol that was doing that under this other regulation. And so what's concerning is that what happens, we've elected an extremist president with Donald Trump in the last few years. What happens in the coming years if we elect someone else like that, right? We need to change these laws before that happens, right? Otherwise, they really can use the Border Patrol for these purposes. And the Border Patrol Union certainly indicates that they're up for it.
Yeah. I mean, because I think one thing that has, at least over the last 20 years, that's kind of stayed consistent is border policy. It's like the lack of border policy, kind of more importantly, but like obviously, the gloves were even more taken off, if you could possibly be more taken off under Trump. But we've had, Obama was nicknamed the deporter in chief, and the fact that we have you seen like kind of any sort of change from say Obama to Trump to Biden in kind of like how they are policed by the government?
Yeah, there was certainly changes from Obama to Trump. But you're right to point out that Obama was not as good on immigration policy as I might have hoped he could be. But it shouldn't have been much of a surprise, right? Because the Secure Fence Act, which authorized 700 miles of walls on the US-Mexico border, that passed in 2006. And it passed something like 83-11 or something like that. Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Barack Obama all voted in favor of that Fence Act, right? So it's really no surprise. I think what we see with immigration issues is kind of a system where during the Democratic presidencies, things just kind of stay the same. They don't necessarily make the situation a lot worse, but they also tend not to try to rein in the spending or the security infrastructure at the border, because I think they see that as a losing political position, right? The left-wing voters tend to be more animated by issues around minimum wage or abortion or child tax credits or all these healthcare, of course, right? So all of those things are more important. So although they probably agree there should be more immigration and don't want to see all of the security at the border and violence towards immigrants, that's not the main priority. So during Democratic administrations, it just kind of tends to stay the same. But then Republicans come into power and ratchet it up again, right? So during the Trump administration, there's a professor at Stanford who cataloged all the small changes that Stephen Miller kind of orchestrated behind the scenes. And there were over 1,000 different changes to immigration policy designed to make it more difficult to immigrate to the US and to make the system more punitive. And so things like Title 42, of course, emerge out of that, but there are just a whole range of small things that they did. Like, for example, to show the ridiculousness of some of these rules, they put in place a rule that if you leave a blank space, a blank question on an immigration document, it's automatically rejected, right? Calling it incomplete. But that means things like, so if you have you live in a house that doesn't have an apartment number, if you left the place on the application where apartment number existed blank, instead of writing in A, they would reject your application, right? So there's a place, I think, for 5 different siblings on there. And so if you only had one sibling and you left the last 4 spaces blank, it was rejected because you turned in a blank application, right? So there are just a whole series of changes like that happened during the Trump administration, designed to reduce immigration to the country. And it was successful. I think scholars have suggested that maybe 2 million people who would have immigrated to the US normally under legal mechanisms were not able to during those 4 years, right? You could suggest that contributes to some of the labor shortages that we hear about today.
Yeah, no, I've gone through the process with a friend of mine, and the immigration paperwork is, every single time I have somebody tell me, oh, it's easy to do, it's easiest country to immigrate into, and I'm like, yeah, if you got like a couple $100,000 and you have immigration lawyers on your side and that sort of thing, super easy. But if you're just a random person who is has a standard or whatever middle class job, even, it's mind-blowingly difficult. Do you think that this is I guess the last question, do you think that there's any reform? I mean, I'm not I'm not a reform person on when it comes to a lot of policing, but I mean, I don't know. I see the theoretical need. I see the need for some sort of like a border, even possible, or of a border patrol or something like that. But I mean, like the institution of the border patrol does not seem like it is an agency that is able to be reformed in any way, shape, and form.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would suggest is try to think a little broader. Do we really need a border patrol? The US did not have a border patrol until 1924, right? So it existed for 100 and some years without it, right? So it's not something that is really traditional, right? If you want to get back to the traditional ways the US was run, that's not something that existed in those period of time. But so, my general position is maybe we don't need it, right? But if we're trying to think a little bit more, and a second point along those lines is, what was it founded for? It was founded as a racial police force. And what is the evidence suggest it does now? It does racial policing. So yeah, it's hard to see how you reform that. But okay, leaving that aside, what are things that we could push for in a shorter term that might improve some of these situations? One clear thing would be to shrink that 100-mile border zone, right? As I show in the book, it's just an administrative decision that happened in 1947 without any public input or debate. So the Department of Homeland Security could set in motion a process to change that today, right? And start to rein that in. A number of Congress people have also been talking about that. The squad has put off some reforms for the Border Patrol over the years that has suggested shrinking that border zone. Pat Leahy, senator from Vermont, he was stopped at a Border Patrol checkpoint about a decade ago, and he got all angry about it. And so each year he's put in place a new reform to make the border zone 25 miles from borders and coastlines. But I would suggest, 5 miles is probably, if you're really interested in stopping immigration as the main purpose of a border patrol, something like 58% of border patrol apprehensions already happen within 1 mile of the border. So the idea that they need to be patrolling so deep in the United States is just not an accurate one, even if that's what you're trying to achieve, which I would say is not necessarily something we should be trying to achieve, right? So the impact instead is this major trade-off, right, on civil liberties of American citizens and immigrants alike, but also migrant deaths, right? I mean, why are people dying in a trailer near San Antonio? It's because they're trying to sneak past the interior checkpoint, right? That's why they're doing that. Why are people dying in the deserts of Arizona 50 miles north of the border? That's because they're trying to go around these interior checkpoints, right? So there's a direct correlation between the size, the extent, and the depth of this border enforcement in the US and the violence that it produces on migrant bodies. And so to me, that alone is a reason to reform it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for your time, and thank you so much for this book and your previous work as well. This is Nobody is Protected: How the Border Patrol Became the Most Dangerous Police Force in the United States. I was here with Dr. Reece Jones, and can't recommend this book enough. I don't think we talk about the Border Patrol enough, as when we talk, especially when we talk about policing in America. It is, yeah. Sorry. Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Reece. I'm sorry, was a little bit out of it today. So I apologize for my questions not being like as sharp as they might be. You did absolutely amazing though. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. It was a pleasure.